The warehouse was supposed to be empty. That was the entire premise of the job. I was hired to work alone, which meant the company had already cleared out whatever skeleton crew had been maintaining the facility before. I was the sole employee, the only person responsible for the building's operations, security, and basic maintenance. The solitude was supposed to be a selling point. Some people the hiring manager had suggested preferred working without the complications of human interaction. I was not one of those people, but I needed the job, and the job needed someone willing to work alone. My name is Todd Williams, and I was 35 years old when I took the position at Comtech Logistics. I'd spent the previous 12 years in security work, moving between companies, watching cameras, and monitoring alarms, and occasionally encountering actual problems that required my intervention. The warehouse job was a lateral move into a completely different industry, but it offered something my security positions never had: stability and solitude in equal measure, a fixed salary, benefits, a 2-year contract with guaranteed hours. The company Comtech Logistics operated warehouses across the Midwest. This facility, located outside Chicago in a small industrial park near Joliet, had been recently acquired as part of a portfolio expansion. They needed someone to manage it while they figured out what to do with it long term. Security work had taught me to read spaces, to understand how people moved through areas, what patterns indicated normalcy and what patterns indicated intrusion. It had also taught me to recognize when something was off, when the environment around me had shifted in ways that the conscious mind couldn't immediately articulate. I'd built a career on paying attention to details that most people missed. 12 years of watching screens, reviewing footage, documenting anomalies. 12 years of maintaining a professional distance from the situations I observed. Which is why I noticed on my third night of work that someone else was already in the warehouse. I started on a Tuesday in March. The warehouse was a massive structure, maybe 200,000 square feet, built sometime in the 1970s. It had the particular aesthetic of industrial functionality: concrete floors, metal shelving, overhead lighting that hummed with a frequency just below consciousness. The building was nearly empty. There were a few pieces of equipment scattered throughout, some pallets of merchandise destined for other facilities, but mostly it was just space. Vast, echoing, utterly silent except for the sound of my footsteps and the perpetual hum of the climate control system. My training had been minimal. A manager named Robert had spent approximately 2 hours showing me the basics: where the security system was, how to operate the loading dock doors, where the emergency procedures were documented, how to submit reports on inventory status and facility maintenance. Then he'd handed me a set of keys and told me that he'd check in by phone every other week, and that I should call immediately if anything serious happened. "What counts as serious?" I'd asked. "Structural damage," he'd said. "Fire, security breach, equipment failure that affects the climate control, that kind of thing." "And if I just need to talk to someone?" He'd looked at me like I'd asked a strange question. "You have a phone," he'd said. "Call someone you know." Then he'd left, and I'd been alone in the warehouse. The silence had been so complete that it took me a few minutes to adjust to it. No background noise, no traffic sounds from outside, just the hum of the systems and the occasional creak of the building settling. It was the kind of silence that made you aware of your own heartbeat, your own breathing. The kind of silence that reminded you that you were truly alone. The first 2 nights had been about orientation. I'd walked the entire facility, familiarizing myself with the layout, noting where things were, understanding the geography of the space I was now responsible for. The warehouse was divided into sections by the placement of shelving units and support columns. Section A contained the loading and receiving area. Section B was climate-controlled storage for temperature-sensitive goods. Sections C through F were general storage, mostly empty. I'd charted them mentally, created a cognitive map that would serve me in the darkness. The job itself was straightforward. I made rounds twice a day, checked the security system, monitored the inventory management software, ensured that deliveries were processed correctly. Most days, I didn't actually interact with anyone. Drivers would back into the loading dock, leave their cargo, and leave. I'd verify what had been delivered, input it into the system, and move on. It was work that could be done in a state of mental absence, which suited me fine. The security system showed me 12 camera feeds. The cameras covered the main areas: loading dock, primary storage sections, hallways, emergency exits. There were blind spots, areas where the cameras couldn't see, but those were mostly in the back corners of the facility where nothing of value was stored. I'd reviewed the footage from the previous weeks, looking for any indication of unusual activity. Everything had been static. The warehouse had appeared completely empty. By the end of the second night, I'd established a routine: morning rounds at 8 a.m., afternoon rounds at 2 p.m., evening rounds at 6 p.m., security check at 10 p.m. before I left for the day. I left around 10:30 and drove back to the apartment I'd rented near the facility. I was usually asleep by midnight and awake by 6:30. It was a schedule that created a kind of meditative rhythm, the same actions performed in the same sequence, day after day. On the third night, around 8:30 p.m. during my evening rounds, I noticed something odd in Section D. Section D was one of the less frequently used areas. It contained some older shelving units and a few pieces of equipment that were waiting to be sold or scrapped. Nobody went back there much. The merchandise that came through the warehouse moved through Sections A, B, and C. Section D was essentially abandoned space, the kind of place that could harbor almost anything without being noticed. And someone had made a nest back there. It wasn't a deliberate nest, not exactly, but there was evidence of habitation: a blanket, old and worn, folded loosely and placed on top of a storage container, an empty water bottle, a candy wrapper. Small things, the kind of things you might not notice if you weren't specifically looking for signs of intrusion. But I was specifically looking. I'd been trained to look. I stood in the middle of Section D, looking at the collection of items, and I felt that particular alertness that came from recognizing a security breach. Someone had been in this warehouse. Someone had spent time here. Someone was using this space for something. My hands went through the motions of documentation, mentally noting the placement of objects, the condition of the blanket, the size of the water bottle, gathering information the way I'd been trained to gather it. The rational explanation was that a delivery driver had left these items, or someone from the previous company, or they'd been in the warehouse when we'd taken over the facility and nobody had noticed them. Those explanations made sense. But my 12 years of security work had taught me to trust my instincts, and my instincts were telling me that someone wasn't just passing through. Someone was living here. Someone had made a deliberate choice to establish themselves in this specific location. The placement of the item suggested intentionality. The blanket wasn't carelessly tossed. It was folded, prepared for future use. The water bottle was positioned to be easily accessible. These were the arrangements of someone planning to return. I called Robert immediately. "There's evidence of someone spending time in the warehouse," I'd said without preamble. "Blanket, water bottle, garbage. It looks like someone's been using Section D as a sleeping area." There had been a pause on the line. Not a long pause, but long enough to register discomfort. "Are you sure?" Robert had asked. "It's a blanket," I'd said, "on a storage container, in a warehouse that's supposed to be empty. It's not exactly ambiguous." "What else is there?" I described what I'd found in detail: the precise location of each item, the condition of the blanket, the brand of water bottle. He'd asked me to check if there was anything else, any other evidence of habitation. I'd done a more thorough search, looking more carefully at the shelves, checking corners and enclosed spaces, examining the floor for footprints or other signs of passage. I didn't find anything else in Section D, but the presence of the blanket and water bottle was enough to suggest that someone had made regular use of this space. "I'll have maintenance come out tomorrow and do a full inspection," Robert had said. "For now, just secure it. Put the items in a room you can lock. We'll figure out where they came from." I'd collected the blanket and water bottle and the candy wrapper, and I'd placed them in my office, a small room off the main warehouse floor. I'd locked the door behind me. The items had remained there for 3 days before Robert had someone come pick them up. The maintenance crew that showed up had been perfunctory, spending maybe an hour walking through the warehouse, checking for signs of intrusion. They'd found nothing else unusual. The blanket and water bottle had been anomalies, they'd suggested, something left by a previous worker or a delivery person taking a break during a shift. The incident had unsettled me, though. It had broken the illusion that I was truly alone in the warehouse. Someone had been here. Someone had made use of the space. And while they hadn't left any other evidence, the items suggested a level of comfort with the facility, a sense of belonging or familiarity that went beyond a quick break during a shift. I'd increased my security checks after that. I'd started doing evening rounds at 9 p.m. in addition to my regular schedule. I'd paid more attention to the loading dock area, checking for signs of unauthorized access. I'd reviewed the camera footage more carefully, looking for any indication of movement during the hours when I wasn't present. I'd examined the locks, checked for signs of forcing or manipulation. The professional part of me had kicked in, the security expert who knew how to investigate a breach. But I'd found nothing else unusual. The warehouse remained as silent and empty as it had been on my first day. No footprints on the floors, no evidence of tampering with the access points, no additional items hidden in the storage areas. It was as though the blanket and water bottle had been isolated incidents, anomalies in an otherwise empty building. 2 weeks after finding the blanket, I found the food. I was doing my morning rounds, walking through Section E, which was mostly empty and rarely needed checking, but I decided to be thorough to make sure there was no other evidence of unauthorized occupation I might have missed. And in a corner of Section E, partially hidden behind one of the support columns, I found a small collection of items. There was a backpack. It was a decent quality pack, the kind you'd buy at an outdoor supply store. Inside were clothes carefully folded, a few personal items, and several cans of food, beans, soup, vegetables, the kind of non-perishable items someone would bring if they were planning to stay somewhere for an extended period without access to a kitchen.
That specific combination.
I sat down on the concrete floor, staring at the backpack, trying to process what this meant. Someone wasn't just passing through the warehouse. Someone was living here. Someone had taken up residence, had established a base camp, had supplies to sustain themselves. Someone had made a commitment to being in this space. And more importantly, I'd just found their supplies, which meant that person was going to come back looking for them,
My ex-wife,
which meant they were expecting to be able to return to this location and retrieve what they'd hidden. I'd called Robert again, trying to keep the stress out of my voice.
Fall River,
This
Amazon,
time,
overnight.
he'd been more concerned. I
The
could hear the
fulfillment
shift
center
in
is
his
on
tone,
Milliken Boulevard,
the recognition
out past the
that this
industrial
had
stretch where
escalated
everything's
beyond the
either a
level
trucking
of a
company
minor
or a
security
build.
issue.
Again, do a sweep
A
of sectors
backpack
1
with
through
clothes
3.
and food,
Take a break around
he'd
2.
said.
Sweep.
That's more serious than a blanket. That's an active occupation. What do you want me to do? I'd asked. Leave it there, he'd said. For now. I'm going to contact our legal department and figure out the proper procedure for dealing with a potential trespasser. Don't touch anything else. Don't try to confront anyone. If you see this person, you call the police immediately. Do you understand? I'd understood, but understanding and actually being able to execute that understanding were two different things. The professional part of me understood the protocol. The human part of me was already creating narratives about who this person was and why they were living in an empty warehouse. That evening, I'd done my rounds early, around 5 p.m. instead of my usual 6 p.m. I'd wanted to complete my check while it was still light outside, while I could see everything clearly. and I'd half hoped, half feared that I might actually see whoever was occupying the warehouse. I didn't. But I did notice something else. In Section B, the climate-controlled area, someone had set up a more permanent living situation. There was a mattress, old but functional, placed against one wall. There was a folding table with a camping stove on it. There were blankets arranged in a kind of nest around the mattress, a battery-powered lamp, a small mirror mounted on one of the support columns. This wasn't just passing through. This was someone who'd created a home. This was someone who'd put thought into making the space habitable. My 12 years of security work had trained me to observe without judgment, to document what I saw and report it to the appropriate people. But standing in Section B, looking at this makeshift living space, I felt something shift in my thinking. This wasn't an intrusion. This was a sanctuary. This was someone's answer to homelessness or displacement or whatever situation had brought them to seek shelter in an empty warehouse. I reported all of this to Robert, who'd promised to have our legal team contact me within 2 days with instructions. In the meantime, he'd suggested I continue my normal routine but avoid confrontation. If I saw the person, I should observe from a distance and call the police. That night, I'd done my 10 p.m. security check, and I'd found evidence that the person had been there recently. The stove had been used. There was fresh ash in it. The bedding had been disturbed, as though someone had been lying on the mattress not long before I arrived. The lamp had been on, using battery power. Someone had been here. Someone had been making use of this space as a living area. They were timing their presence to avoid me. They knew my schedule. They knew when I was likely to be in the warehouse, and they were making sure to be elsewhere during those times, which meant they were paying attention. They were observing. They were aware of my routines with enough precision to structure their own routines around them. It was like looking into a mirror of my own security practices. I watched them. They watched me. We were conducting surveillance on each other, except I was being paid to do it, and they weren't. I'd left the warehouse that night feeling a creeping sense of unease that I couldn't quite rationalize away. The situation had become complicated. It was no longer simply a security breach. It had become something more human, more complicated. The next morning, Robert called back with instructions. The legal team had advised that we should treat this as an active trespassing situation. They'd recommended that I change my routine, vary my schedule to make it unpredictable. They'd also recommended that I document everything, take photographs of the living spaces, note times and dates when I found evidence of recent activity. And they'd recommended that if I actually encountered the person, I should not attempt confrontation. I should simply call the police and provide my location. They're going to send someone to meet with you in person in 2 days, Robert had said. Someone from our security team. In the meantime, just be careful. I'd taken his advice and started varying my schedule. Instead of doing rounds at consistent times, I'd do them at random intervals. Sometimes my morning round would be at 7 a.m., sometimes at 9. Sometimes my afternoon round would be at 1, sometimes at 4. I'd also started staying later some days, leaving at midnight or even 1 a.m., hoping to catch whoever was living in the warehouse. I never did. But the evidence of their presence became more obvious. On days when I'd changed my routine to try to catch them, I'd find signs of recent activity. Used dishes in the sink in the employee break room, a sink I hadn't even known was functional, wet footprints on the floor in Section C. Once I found a jacket hanging on one of the shelving units, still damp, as though it had recently been washed. Someone was living here. Someone was establishing a presence. Someone was marking this space as theirs. For 12 years, I'd maintained the position of observer. I'd watched situations unfold. I'd documented evidence. I'd reported to management. I'd never gotten personally involved. That was the job. That was what security work was. You watched, you reported, you let other people make decisions. But something about this situation was different. Something about knowing that someone was watching me, observing my routines, timing their presence around mine, made me feel less like an observer and more like a participant in something I didn't fully understand. The security team member, a woman named Patricia, showed up on a Thursday morning. She was in her 40s, with the efficient demeanor of someone who'd dealt with similar situations many times before. She'd spent 2 hours walking through the warehouse with me, documenting the living spaces, taking photographs, making notes about security vulnerabilities. She'd moved through the facility with the same careful attention that I used. We were colleagues, I realized. We were both trained observers. "This person has been here for a while," she'd said, standing in Section B, looking at the organized living arrangement. "They know the layout of the facility. They know your schedule. They know where the camera blind spots are." "Camera blind spots?" I'd asked. "The security system you have covers maybe 70% of the warehouse," she'd said. "There are sections where the cameras can't see. Whoever this is has positioned their living spaces in those areas. They've done reconnaissance." That observation had made the situation feel less like a coincidence and more like a deliberate occupation. This wasn't someone who'd wandered in and decided to take shelter. This was someone who'd planned to be here, someone who'd studied the facility, understood its systems, made calculated decisions about where to establish themselves. Patricia had recommended several upgrades to the security system, additional cameras to cover the blind spots, and she'd also recommended that the company install a better access control system. The current system, she'd noted, was older and relatively easy to bypass if someone knew how. "How would someone know how?" I'd asked. "They worked here before," Patricia had said matter-of-factly, "or they worked somewhere similar, or they spent time studying the system before actually entering the building. The point is, this is someone with knowledge. This isn't a random homeless person taking shelter. This is intentional. This is strategic." After Patricia had left, I'd been alone again, but the warehouse felt different. Before, the solitude had felt peaceful, like I had a space to myself. Now it felt like I was sharing the space with someone I'd never actually seen, someone who was deliberately avoiding me, someone who knew the facility better than I did, someone who'd made a choice to be here and had invested time and effort in making that choice sustainable. I'd started bringing a flashlight on my rounds even in daylight. I'd started making more noise, talking to myself, making my presence known. The logical part of my brain understood that this wasn't going to actually deter someone determined to stay, but the anxious part of my brain found the act of announcement comforting. At least, if they heard me coming, they'd have time to hide. At least I wouldn't stumble upon them unexpectedly. 2 weeks after Patricia's visit, I finally saw them. I was doing an evening round around 8 p.m., walking through Section C. I'd stopped to check on a pallet of merchandise that had been delivered that afternoon, and I'd looked up, and I'd seen a figure at the far end of the section, maybe 60 feet away. It was a person. Definitely a person. They were standing motionless, looking at me, and I was looking at them. For a moment, we were just observing each other across the empty warehouse space. It was like a moment suspended outside of time. Two people connected by sight across the void of the warehouse, neither moving, neither speaking, just acknowledging each other's existence. Then they'd turned and walked away, disappearing behind one of the shelving units. I should have called the police. Those were my explicit instructions. I should have called immediately and reported a sighting and given my location. That's what Patricia had told me to do. That's what protocol dictated. But I didn't. Instead, I'd followed. I'd walked toward where the person had disappeared, trying to move quietly, trying to see where they'd gone. But by the time I'd reached the shelving unit, they were gone. I'd looked around the corner, checked the adjacent aisles, but there was no sign of them. They'd vanished. It was as though they'd anticipated my pursuit and had planned a route that would allow them to disappear before I could catch up. I'd walked the warehouse for another hour, searching, hoping to see them again, but I'd found nothing. Eventually, I'd given up and completed my rounds, then left for the day. I'd thought about calling Robert, reporting that I'd actually seen the person, but something had stopped me. Some part of me had recognized that seeing them, that moment of mutual observation, was significant in a way I couldn't quite articulate. They'd let me see them. They'd stood there long enough for me to register their presence, and then they disappeared. It felt like communication. Over the next few days, I started deliberately trying to encounter them again. I'd vary my routine in the opposite direction now, trying to be predictable enough that they could find me. I'd spend time in the sections where they'd set up their living spaces. I'd leave the lights on in the evening. I'd make sure my presence was obvious. And slowly, they started appearing. Not approaching me, not actually engaging, but appearing, standing at the end of a corridor, visible for a moment before disappearing, making their presence known in the way that they knew I was making mine known. We were conducting a kind of dance, the trespasser and me. They'd appear, I'd pursue. They'd disappear, and I'd search. But we never actually encountered each other directly. It was a choreography of almost meetings, a communication conducted through proximity and observation. I realized after about a week of this that I didn't actually want to catch them. The job had become less about security and more about the interaction itself. The warehouse had transformed from an empty space where I worked alone into a shared space where I was part of something. The trespasser had given my job meaning. They'd given my solitude a purpose. For the first time since taking the position, I felt like the work actually mattered. One evening, around 10 p.m., I found a note in my office. It was written on a piece of warehouse memo paper in handwriting I didn't recognize. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, the script of someone who'd been taught to write formally and had maintained that formality despite years of disuse. The note said, "I'm not going to hurt you. I just need a place to stay." I'd read it several times, trying to understand what it meant. The trespasser was telling me something. They were communicating directly, dropping the pretense of avoidance, making their situation explicit. They were also acknowledging that they understood the situation from my perspective. They knew I was afraid. They wanted to assure me that the fear was unnecessary. I'd called Robert the next morning and told him about the note. He'd gone quiet on the line. "You need to bring that to the police," he'd said finally. "This is escalating beyond what we can handle internally. This person is becoming too comfortable. They're establishing communication. That's not a good sign." But I hadn't brought it to the police. I'd kept the note in my desk, and I'd continued my routines. And I'd continued encountering the trespasser in that choreographed way we'd developed. I'd kept the note because keeping it felt like participating in something that mattered more than protocol. It felt like choosing to be human instead of choosing to be professional. A week after the note, I made a decision that violated every protocol I'd ever followed in 12 years of security work. I left food in Section B. Nothing elaborate, just a couple of sandwiches, some fruit, a bottle of water. I left them on the folding table next to the camping stove, and I left a note that said, "For you, Todd." The next morning, the food was gone. In its place was another note, "Thank you." This should have felt wrong. This should have felt like I was failing in my job, like I was compromising the security of the facility, like I was becoming complicit in a trespass. And on some level, I knew that it was all of those things. I was violating my employment contract. I was providing assistance to someone I was supposed to be reporting to the authorities. I was making a choice that was fundamentally opposed to everything my position dictated. But it didn't feel wrong. It felt like the first genuine human interaction I'd had since taking the job. It felt like I was making a choice that was actually mine, independent of protocols and procedures and the expectations of management. It felt like mattering, like the work was about something more than security and surveillance. For the next 2 weeks, we conducted an exchange. I'd leave food, they'd take it, and leave notes. Simple notes. "Thank you. The soup was good. I'm sorry for the mess in Section C." I cleaned it up. Gradually, through the medium of written communication, I learned things about them. Their name was James. They'd been living rough for about 8 months after a construction job in the city had dried up and cost them their apartment. They'd been bouncing between shelters and the streets, trying to save money, trying to find another job that would allow them to afford rent again. They'd found their way to the warehouse by accident, had discovered the climate control in Section B made it habitable in a way that most of the other places they'd slept were not. They'd been trying not to cause any damage, not to take anything that didn't belong to them. They just needed a place to exist for a while. I found myself reading these notes over and over, something in the story resonating with me. I was 35 years old and working alone in a warehouse. James was 32 and living in one. The difference between our situations felt arbitrary, contingent on circumstances that could have gone differently if a few variables had shifted, if I'd lost my job instead of gaining one, if I'd had worse luck or worse timing, or been born into different circumstances. The gap between security and precarity felt thin. The gap between observer and observed felt thinner still. On a Friday evening, about 3 weeks into our silent communication, I found a note that said, "I'm leaving soon. I found a job. Started Monday. It's not much, but it's something. I wanted you to know that I'm grateful. You didn't have to help me. You could have called the police. You could have followed protocol. But you chose not to. That matters. It matters more than you might think." Something in that note made me sad. The exchange we'd been conducting, this silent dialogue of food and gratitude, had become the structure of my days. Without it, the job would return to being what it had been before: solitude and routine. In the absence of any genuine human contact, the work would lose its meaning again. I left a note in return. "Stay as long as you need. I'm not going to report you. I'm not going to call the police. Whatever happens, whatever comes next, that's not going to change." The next morning, the note was still there, uncollected. And when I did my rounds, I found that the living spaces in Section B had been cleared out. The mattress was gone. The blankets were gone. The table and camping stove had been removed. The lamp was gone. There was nothing left to suggest that anyone had ever been there. James had left. He'd taken his things and he'd gone. He'd made a choice to leave before he was forced to leave. The warehouse felt emptier after that. Not physically emptier, the space itself was unchanged, but emptier in some essential way, as though something vital had been removed and wasn't being replaced. I continued my routines. I made my rounds. I checked the security system. I documented inventory. I did exactly what I was supposed to do. But the job had lost its meaning. Without James to communicate with, without that silent exchange of food and gratitude, I was just a man watching an empty building. 2 months later, Robert called to tell me that the company had decided to close down the facility. They were consolidating operations at a larger warehouse 20 miles away. My contract would be terminated in 4 weeks. They'd provide severance equivalent to 3 months of salary, but after that, I was on my own. 4 weeks. I had 4 weeks to finish what I'd started. On my last day, I left the warehouse at my usual time, 10:30 p.m. I locked the doors. I set the security system. I did everything I was supposed to do. But I left the back emergency exit unlocked. It was a violation of protocol, a decision that would show up in the security logs as negligence. But I knew what I was doing. I was leaving a door open. I was offering a possibility. I was saying, without words, that if James ever needed shelter again, if he ever found himself back in this position, he would have options. 3 days later, the facility was officially closed. The company sent a crew to seal it, to prepare it for eventual demolition. I wasn't there to see it happen. I'd already moved on to a new job, a different warehouse, a different building with different people. But I kept thinking about that unlocked door. I kept thinking about James and whether he'd gone back, whether he'd found his way in, whether he'd understood the gesture I was making. That was 6 months ago. I'm working security at a different facility now, this one closer to the city. It's a newer building with better systems and more cameras and actual staff. The solitude is gone, replaced by the complicated dynamics of working with other people. It should feel like an improvement, more security, better pay, actual colleagues to interact with. But I find myself thinking about the warehouse outside Chicago. I find myself wondering what happened to James. I find myself considering whether I made a mistake by not telling him to stay, by not offering him something more concrete than food and an unlocked door. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm doing my rounds at the new facility, I see someone in the security footage that doesn't belong there. Just a glimpse, a figure moving through a blind spot, gone before I can confirm what I've seen. I never report it. I just note it and move on. I document it in the security logs as a potential camera malfunction and move on with my shift. Because I understand now what I didn't understand before. The buildings we work in, the spaces we're responsible for, they exist for reasons we don't fully comprehend. They're not just containers for merchandise and equipment. They're refugees. They're last resorts. They're places where people who've run out of options come to find shelter. And the job of security isn't really about keeping people out. It's about maintaining the illusion that we're in control of these spaces, that we understand what happens inside them, that we're aware of everything that occurs within their boundaries. But we're not. We're never really in control. We're just observers, documenting what we see, reporting to people who make decisions based on information we provide. And sometimes, if we're lucky, if we're brave enough or human enough, we get to make choices that aren't about observation and reporting. We get to make choices that are actually about being human. We get to choose compassion over protocol. I think about the warehouse sometimes, and I wonder if James ever went back. I wonder if he found that unlocked door and understood what it meant. I wonder if he's still out there, looking for places that will accept him, spaces that have decided to stop asking questions. And I wonder if someday, when I'm doing my rounds and I see a figure in the shadows, it will be someone I can actually help, someone I can communicate with without protocol in the way, someone who needs exactly what I'm capable of offering. The job continues, the rounds continue, the security checks continue. But something fundamental has changed. I'm no longer just watching. I'm waiting for the moment when observation becomes something more, when the walls come down, when the boundaries dissolve, and we recognize that we're all just trying to find a place to exist, a space that will have us, a warehouse willing to shelter the lost.